A community is reeling, and millions of questions were left unanswered in Moscow, Idaho, where 4 University of Idaho students were brutally stabbed to death. Police barely had any evidence until one crucial piece of DNA linked a suspect to the crime. Tonight, we're diving back into the Idaho student murders. I'll be talking about the evidence investigators collected against him and the single piece of trash that led to his arrest. Let's get into it.
The affidavit detailing why police arrested Bryan Kohberger.
One of the key pieces of evidence here, which police were asking about, was that white Hyundai Elantra. And we know, according to our sources, a Hyundai Elantra was pulled from Kohberger's house earlier today.
A single used Q-tip helped investigators solve the Idaho University murders case.
Hi, I'm Katie Ring, and this is Crime House Daily, your weekday true crime companion. We follow the cases making headlines now, where justice is still unfolding. This is a Night Watch episode bringing you today's biggest crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel at Crime House Daily so you never miss an episode. This episode discusses active criminal cases and breaking news. The information we share is based on what's publicly available at the time of recording and may change as new evidence comes to light. We aim to inform, not to decide guilt or innocence. So everyone mentioned is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Tonight is part 4 of our 5-episode deep dive on the Idaho student murder case. Last time we examined the clues that led to the identification of 28-year-old Bryan Kohberger as the prime suspect in the murders of Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin, Kaylee Gonzalez, and Madison Mogan. Tonight, we will retrace the steps that helped investigators make huge breaks in the case, and we'll unpack the bizarre moments from their initial conversations with Bryan Kohberger. In the aftermath of the Idaho student murders, the police zero in on 2 major pieces of evidence: a white Hyundai that was driving around the King Road neighborhood at the time of the murders, and a knife sheath found at the crime scene. While scientists work on DNA samples from the sheath, investigators focus on the car. They're able to link it to Bryan Kohberger, even though he changed the registration from Pennsylvania to Washington State just a few days after the murders. And on December 19th, 2022, a little over a month after the murders, they confirmed that DNA on the sheath is a likely match for Kohberger as well. But by the time they confirm this, Kohberger isn't in the area anymore. Earlier that same day, he'd lost his funding for the PhD program at Washington State University, located 10 miles from the University of Idaho. And he was also fired from his TA position after over a dozen complaints were made about his combative and sexist behavior. However, this doesn't mean that Kohberger is kicked out of the program entirely. He can still take classes and earn his PhD. He just has to pay his own tuition now, and he can't teach undergraduates. Everything is unraveling for him. Not only is his schooling at risk, but the police are quickly closing in. And when it comes time to head home to Pennsylvania for winter break, Kohberger barely leaves anything behind. He clears the place out almost completely and even gets rid of his shower curtain. Not the kind of thing you do if you plan on coming back. Kohberger's dad joins him for the cross-country road trip back to the East Coast. Everything seems totally normal, but Kohberger gets pulled over in Indiana on 2 separate occasions, just 10 minutes apart, both times for tailgating. He's let off with a warning both times. A lot of people thought that the police or the FBI might have been tailing him at this point, but the FBI made a statement that they were completely by chance and not prearranged or directed by the FBI. And since the DNA test hadn't even been confirmed at this point, the Indiana police said they weren't even aware of who Kohberger was. But the authorities are working hard on the case. And as soon as they confirm the DNA is a likely match for Bryan Kohberger, they jump into action. On December 20th, 2022, FBI agents arrive in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, where the Kohberger family lives. Bryan Kohberger and his dad have been home for 4 days after a marathon drive from Washington. But instead of busting down the door, the FBI agents placed the Kohbergers under 24-hour secret surveillance. Even though Bryan was their main suspect, they didn't have any actual sample of DNA to test it against the DNA found on the sheath. So while the authorities back in Idaho gather more evidence, the agents in Pennsylvania quietly monitor Kohberger, waiting for a chance to grab something with his DNA on it without him noticing. Meanwhile, on December 23rd, Moscow Police Corporal Brett Payne, the same officer who found the sheath at the crime scene, obtains a warrant for Kohberger's cell phone location records between November 12th and 14th, which is the period just before, during, and right after the murders. Pretty soon, they're looking at some highly suspicious activity. At 2:47 a.m. on November 13th, the night of the murders, Kohberger's phone connected to a tower that provides service in Pullman, Washington, where he lives. After that, his phone doesn't connect to any towers for more than 2 hours. Remember, authorities have determined that the murders occurred between 4 and 4:20 a.m. on the 13th. To detectives, it seems highly likely that Kohberger turned off his phone shortly before 3 a.m., specifically to avoid pinging any towers. Digital forensics experts were able to determine that Kohberger manually turned off his phone at 100% charge, which means this was purposely done, and not just his phone dying from low battery. Looking at his records, they also saw that this was very out of character for him. Data shows that his phone was turned back on at 4:48 a.m. When it turns on, it connects to a series of towers consistent with driving, south of Moscow, Idaho on Highway 95, then west across the state border into Uniontown, Washington, and finally north into Pullman, Washington. Pullman is only 10 miles from Moscow, but Kohberger's route is about 4 times as long, both in terms of distance and drive time. Basically, he makes a big U-turn, which detectives find confusing. It seems like he may have been taking back roads, perhaps as a way to avoid cameras or traffic stops, which he'd be more likely to encounter on the main roads. But at the same time, Kohberger's route requires him to spend a lot more time in Idaho before crossing a state border. His decision is a kind of mystery, but the data is suspicious enough that Corporal Payne gets another warrant, this time for Kohberger's cell phone location data going all the way back to June 2022, 5 months before the murders. And that data leads to another chilling revelation. Between June 2022 and November 13th, 2022, the night of the murders, Bryan Kohberger's cell phone connects to towers near 1122 King Road on 12 different occasions, and all except one of which were in the early morning or evening hours. If you remember, Kaylee Gonzalez thought a strange man was watching her in the weeks leading up to the murders. And now authorities believe Kohberger may have been watching the house for months. At this stage, there's no concrete evidence that Kohberger was the person Kaylee saw watching her, or that he was the one who broke in the time the housemates found their door unlocked. But his cell phone data strongly suggests that he was aware of the housemates long before they were killed, and he may have been watching them for a long time before he killed them. Everything is starting to fall into place, but Moscow Police Corporal Brett Payne doesn't want to jump to conclusions. So he reviews all the cell phone data again, just in case there's something he's missing. And it turns out there is, and it's huge. On November 13th, the day of the murders, Bryan Kohberger's cell phone location returned to King Road. About 5 hours after the murders, between 9:12 and 9:21 a.m., his phone pinged the towers that cover 1122 King Road. This would have been before Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk went outside to call their friends, and almost 3 hours before the friends called 911. During this time, Kohberger's car isn't shown on any security footage. But then at 12:36 p.m., around 8 hours after the murders and a half hour after police arrived at the scene, Kohberger's phone pinged in Clarkston, Washington, following the same apparent driving route as before. There are a couple things to point out here. First, people have wondered if Kohberger went back to the scene because he realized he was missing the sheath. Maybe he wanted to try and retrieve it, but wasn't able to. When it comes to evidence, though, just because someone's cell phone is located somewhere doesn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they were necessarily located with it. Corporal Payne knows this, so he starts looking for any corroborating evidence to place Kohberger in the same location as his phone. And he is able to find something. At 12:49 p.m. on November 13th, Kohberger and his Hyundai Elantra both appeared on security footage at an Albertsons grocery store in Clarkston, Washington. The store is located right by the Idaho border and is on the same route the phone was on. And that's not all. After Kohberger stopped at the grocery store, his phone went dark again from 5:36 to 8:30 p.m. in the area of Johnson, Washington, about a 25-minute drive south of the house. Many people believe that Kohberger was driving around disposing of evidence, which could include blood-stained clothes or even the murder weapon. Regardless of what he was doing out there, Corporal Payne has what he needs to get an arrest warrant. Because over 2,000 miles away in Pennsylvania, FBI agents get exactly what they need to nab their suspect. By December 27, 2022, federal agents have been watching the Kohberger residence for a week. That day, they wait for the family to put their trash out on the curb for pickup. And once they do, agents swoop in and grab it without being seen. They're hoping to find something with Bryan Kohberger's DNA, so they can test it against the profile they have. They dig through the garbage bags, and soon they find something promising: a Q-tip. The agents immediately bag it and then fly back to Idaho to hand it over to the Idaho State Crime Lab. They get the results the very next day, and it gives them exactly what they need to arrest Bryan Kohberger. On December 28, 2022, the authorities got the results from the DNA on the Q-tip they recovered from the Kohberger's family trash. The sample isn't an exact match of the DNA found on the knife sheath, but it is a match for the biological father of the person whose DNA is on the sheath, meaning it's highly likely that Bryan Kohberger's father is the one who used the Q-tip, and Bryan's DNA is on the knife sheath from the crime scene. With this last piece of evidence secured, the authorities get a warrant for Bryan Kohberger's arrest on December 29, 2022. And at 1 a.m. on December 30th, FBI agents and Pennsylvania State Police raid the Kohberger's home. When they enter the house, Bryan tries to run down to his bedroom in the basement, but agents stop him and take him into custody. They then search his room and find a few questionable things, including a handgun, which turns out to be registered to Bryan, 3 empty magazines, some marijuana, which is legal for medicinal use in Pennsylvania, and a self-help book titled Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, which helps readers turn their anger and indecision into action. There's a passage underlined on page 118 of the book, but authorities haven't revealed which parts are underlined. They bag the items, then bring Kohberger in for questioning. Corporal Brett Payne and Idaho State Police Lieutenant Darren Gilbertson, the ex-Marine who helped Corporal Payne identify the K-bar knife, sit down with him. In the interrogation room, Kohberger's demeanor is eerily calm. He makes so much direct eye contact, Payne and Gilbertson are a little uncomfortable. The officers try to get Kohberger to warm up a little so they can start getting some real answers. Kohberger asks about his parents and his dog, and the detectives assure him they're okay. And the 3 men even chat about sports. Then, at some point, Kohberger asks a weird question. He says, quote, "Who else did you arrest?" which has sparked theories that he either had an accomplice, wanted police to think he did, or was hoping his parents didn't get pulled into it. But Payne and Gilbertson don't give him an answer. Instead, they try and talk about the Idaho murders. And as soon as they do, Kohberger shuts down. He tells them he has, quote, "the utmost respect for law enforcement," then asks for a lawyer. Ultimately, Bryan Kohberger is charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary for breaking into the house with intent to commit a felony. After exercising his rights, Kohberger doesn't continue speaking to the officers and doesn't confess at this time. The judge rules that he will be held without bail for 2.5 years while both sides gear up for trial. His charges could also carry the death penalty, which prosecutors announced that they fully intend to pursue. One of the first things they do is obtain a sample of Kohberger's DNA. They compare it to the sample found on the sheath, and it's a direct match. But Kohberger's still not willing to admit to anything. At his first arraignment, he refuses to verbally enter a plea, which is allowed in the state of Idaho and means the judge enters a formal not guilty plea on his behalf. Meanwhile, authorities obtain a warrant to search Kohberger's Amazon purchase history for any activity related to knives or knife accessories. And that's when they discover Kohberger bought a K-bar knife, as well as a knife sharpener in March 2022, 8 months before the murders. Remember, he arrived in Washington to begin his PhD program in June, which was about 4 months after he purchased the knife. Prosecutors also compile some incriminating information that authorities obtained shortly after Kohberger's arrest, including the fact that he nearly emptied out his entire apartment. 2 stains found on a pillow and a mattress left in his apartment tested positive for blood and bodily fluid in preliminary analysis. And finally, the fact that Kohberger's Hyundai Elantra was found to be spotless after he was arrested. Authorities think Kohberger cleaned his car before he and his dad drove to Pennsylvania. And it wasn't just a routine cleaning. Lead prosecutor Bill Thompson said it was like the car, quote, had been essentially disassembled inside. As for Kohberger's defense, they start filing motions to try and get different pieces of evidence excluded. They also try and build an argument that there was another likely suspect, based on 2 separate samples of unidentified male blood. Each sample belonged to a different person, neither of whom was Kohberger. When this development reaches the public, some people think back to Kohberger's strange question when he first spoke with detectives. Who else did you arrest? They wonder if he somehow planted those other blood samples and expected police to chase those leads. No one's buying the defense's alibi either, which is that on the night of the murders, Kohberger was just out for a pleasant nighttime drive. People who have been following the story from day one eagerly await trial. They want answers to the questions that have been haunting them for years now. But that never happens. Come back tomorrow night for our 5th and final episode on the Idaho student murders. We'll dive into what happens in June of 2025 when Bryan Kohberger does something no one expected. What did you think of tonight's case? Drop your thoughts and theories in the comments. And tomorrow night, stay tuned for our final episode in our 5-part Idaho Murders series. See you next time. If you haven't already, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Crimehouse Daily and follow us on social media at Crimehouse247 for real-time updates, because the pursuit of justice never stops.